You can tell everything about a man by how little he demands from the world, she said coldly, not even looking up from her tablet, and that was the exact moment Daniel realized he should have never walked into that glass building in the first place. The elevator doors had opened to a floor that smelled like polished marble and expensive decisions, and now he stood there in a plain button-up shirt that had been ironed twice but still looked out of place among tailored suits and quiet confidence, his fingers tightening slightly around the folder that held his proposal, not for himself but for his 6-year-old daughter's future, and across from him sat Evelyn Carter, CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech firms in the country, a woman known for turning companies around and people away with the same level of efficiency, her expression unreadable, her voice measured, her presence enough to make seasoned executives hesitate, and yet she had dismissed him in less than 30 seconds. A notification buzzed on her desk, briefly lighting up the room, and without missing a beat she flicked it away, as if even time itself needed her permission to interrupt, while Daniel stood there trying to steady his breathing, reminding himself why he had driven 40 miles that morning after dropping his daughter off at school, why he had spent nights working on an idea that he believed could change things not just for him but for people like him, people who didn't have investors or connections or polished resumes, just persistence and something to prove. "I'm not asking for a handout," he said finally, his voice calm but firm, and that made her pause for half a second, just enough to notice him, really notice him, but then her gaze sharpened again, evaluating, calculating, and ultimately dismissing. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city moved in fast lines and distant noise, cars honking, people rushing, a world that didn't wait for anyone, and inside that office, it felt like everything had already decided he didn't belong. A sudden knock at the door interrupted the tension, and an assistant stepped in quickly, whispering something urgent into Evelyn's ear, her expression shifting ever so slightly, a flicker of something unexpected crossing her face before she straightened again, colder than before, as if whatever softness had tried to surface was immediately locked away. "You should go," she said, this time without the earlier edge, but somehow that made it worse, like she wasn't even bothered enough to mock him anymore, and Daniel nodded slowly, turning toward the door, but just as his hand reached for the handle, he heard her voice again, quieter now, almost to herself, too simple, and something about the way she said it lingered in the air longer than it should have, making him hesitate for a fraction of a second before stepping out, unaware that this moment, this dismissal, was about to become the beginning of something neither of them could walk away from. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have, each passing floor blinking in quiet indifference as Daniel stared at his own reflection in the polished steel doors, noticing the faint crease near his collar and the exhaustion in his eyes that no amount of determination could fully hide, and for a moment he questioned whether she had been right, whether, too simple, was just a softer way of saying he didn't belong in rooms like that. But then his phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of that spiral, and when he checked it, he saw a photo his daughter had sent through his sister's phone, a crayon drawing of the two of them standing in front of a small house with a crooked sun in the corner, and underneath it, in uneven handwriting, it said, "Don't give up, Dad," and just like that, something inside him steadied again. Outside the building, the late afternoon air carried a mix of traffic noise and distant sirens, the kind of background chaos that usually faded into nothing but today felt sharper, more present, as if the world itself was reminding him that everything moved forward whether he felt ready or not, and he walked toward his old pickup truck parked 2 blocks away, passing people in suits who didn't look twice at him, blending into the rhythm of a city that rewarded speed and certainty, neither of which he felt in that moment, yet he kept moving anyway. As he reached the truck and opened the door, his phone rang again, this time his daughter's school, and his chest tightened instantly as he answered, only to hear her teacher's calm but concerned voice explaining that his daughter had a mild fever and was asking for him, and without hesitation, he started the engine, pulling out into traffic with a focus that replaced every lingering doubt, because no matter how that meeting had gone, this was what mattered, this was the center of everything he was trying to protect. Across town, high above the streets he now navigated, Evelyn stood by the same window he had looked out of minutes earlier, but her posture had changed slightly, her arms crossed not in authority but in thought, as the assistant who had interrupted earlier handed her a tablet displaying a quick background check she had requested almost without thinking, and as she scrolled, her expression shifted in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, pausing at details that didn't match the quick judgment she Had made, a widowed father, no investors, self-taught, a small but growing local client base built entirely through word of mouth, and then a note about a community project he had helped organize, unpaid, something about building affordable digital tools for small businesses like his own, and she exhaled slowly, the faintest crack forming in the certainty she usually carried so effortlessly. Back on the road, Daniel merged onto the highway, gripping the wheel a little tighter as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lanes, and as he drove, he replayed the meeting in fragments, not the dismissal itself but the moment just before it, that brief pause when she had actually looked at him, really looked, and something about that stayed with him, not as hope exactly, but as a question he couldn't quite shake. And just as he reached the exit toward the school, his phone buzzed again with an unknown number, and for a split second he considered ignoring it, but something told him not to, and as he answered, he had no idea that the voice on the other end was about to reopen a door he thought had already closed. "Hello, is this Daniel Reeves?" the voice on the other end asked, calm but unfamiliar, and as he pulled into the school parking lot, cutting the engine but not the call, Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering, yes, his eyes already scanning the entrance where a few parents stood waiting, their conversations blending into the hum of the late afternoon, and the voice continued, "This is Lauren from Carter Dynamics, Ms. Carter's office," and for a moment, everything around him seemed to narrow, the noise fading just enough for that name to land differently than it had an hour ago, not as a closed door but as something unexpectedly reopening. "She'd like to continue the conversation," Lauren added, her tone professional but not dismissive, and Daniel let out a quiet breath he didn't realize he had been holding, his grip on the phone tightening slightly as he processed the shift, because this wasn't how those meetings usually ended, not for someone like him, not after being reduced to a single word. "I'm at my daughter's school right now," he replied, steady but honest, and there was a brief pause before she responded, "Understood. She's available later this evening or tomorrow morning. She asked me to make sure you knew this is a priority," and that word lingered, heavier than it should have been, carrying a weight that didn't quite match the woman he had just met, and yet something about it felt real. "Tomorrow morning," he said after a beat, choosing certainty over impulse, and as he ended the call, he sat there for a second longer, staring through the windshield as the sun dipped lower, casting a warm glow over the brick building in front of him, and for the first time since leaving that office, he felt something shift, not quite hope, but not doubt either, something in between, something unresolved. The passenger door suddenly opened, pulling him back to the moment, and his daughter climbed in slowly, her small backpack slipping off one shoulder as she leaned against the seat, her cheeks slightly flushed but her eyes lighting up the second she saw him. "You came," she said softly, and he smiled, reaching over to gently brush a strand of hair from her face. "Of course I did," and just like that, everything else faded again, replaced by the simple, undeniable truth of why he kept trying in the first place. As he drove home, the road quieter now, she talked about her day in fragments, skipping over the part where she didn't feel well and focusing instead on a story she had written in class, something about a brave bird that didn't know it could fly until it had to, and Daniel listened, really listened, even as his mind occasionally drifted back to that call, to the word priority, to the way Evelyn's expression had shifted before he left, as if there had been more behind her eyes than she allowed anyone to see. Across the city, in an office now dimmer and quieter than before, Evelyn stood alone, her jacket draped over the back of her chair, the tablet still in her hand as she reread the same line for the third time, the one about him turning down a small acquisition offer months ago because it would have forced him to lay off 2 part-time employees, and she exhaled slowly, setting the tablet down as she walked back to her desk, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened window, and for once, the silence in the room didn't feel like control, it felt like something else, something unfamiliar, something closer to doubt, and as she reached for her phone, hesitating for just a second before picking it up, she realized that the version of him she had dismissed earlier no longer fit the facts in front of her, and that realization didn't sit comfortably, not at all. The next morning arrived faster than Daniel expected, the kind of early light that didn't ask if you were ready but simply showed up anyway, and as he stood in his small kitchen pouring coffee into a chipped mug, his daughter sat at the table wrapped in a blanket, her fever down but her energy still soft, watching him with quiet curiosity as if she could sense something different about him. something unsettled but steady at the same time, and when she asked, "Are you going back to that big building today?" he paused just long enough to choose honesty over reassurance. "Yeah. I think I am," and she nodded like that answer made sense, like trying again was just part of how things worked. The drive into the city felt different this time, not lighter, not heavier, just sharper, every turn more intentional, every red light a moment to replay not the rejection but the call that followed it, and by the time he stepped into the same glass building, he no longer felt like he had wandered into the wrong place, he felt like he had chosen to come back. And that subtle shift changed the way he carried himself as he walked past the front desk, where the receptionist, who hadn't looked at him twice the day before, now greeted him by name, already expecting him. Upstairs, the doors opened to the same polished floor, but the atmosphere felt quieter, more controlled, as if something had been reset overnight, and when Lauren approached him with a polite smile and said, "She's ready for you," there was no waiting this time, no sense of being squeezed into someone else's schedule, just a direct path back into the office he had walked out of less than 24 hours ago. Inside, Evelyn stood near the window, not behind her desk, not shielded by anything, and when she turned to face him, there was a difference he couldn't immediately define, something in the way her posture wasn't as rigid, her expression not as sealed off, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to acknowledge that whatever this was now, it wasn't the same conversation as before. "Thank you for coming back," she said finally, and the words were simple, but the tone carried something unfamiliar, not warmth exactly, but not dismissal either, something closer to respect trying to find its place, and Daniel nodded once, setting his folder down on the table but not opening it yet, because this didn't feel like the moment for presentations or rehearsed pitches. A sudden vibration buzzed across the table as her phone lit up again, the same constant pressure of her world trying to pull her away, but this time she flipped it over without checking, a small decision that didn't go unnoticed, and then she said something that shifted the entire balance of the room. "I was wrong about you," direct, unfiltered, and unexpected in a way that made it land harder than any insult had the day before. And Daniel didn't respond immediately, not out of hesitation but because he was trying to understand what that actually meant coming from someone like her. Outside, a helicopter passed low over the city, its distant thrum cutting briefly through the silence, grounding the moment in something real, something happening beyond just the two of them, and Evelyn took a small step closer, not enough to invade his space but enough to close the gap that had felt so deliberate before, and for the first time, there was something in her eyes that wasn't control, wasn't calculation, but something more uncertain, more human, as if she was standing at the edge of a realization she hadn't planned for, and as she reached for his folder, hesitating for just a fraction of a second before opening it, she said quietly, almost as if admitting it to herself as much as to him, "And I don't like being wrong," and in that moment, Daniel realized this wasn't just about a second chance at a meeting anymore, it was the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet, something that was already starting to challenge the version of themselves they had been holding on to. Daniel watched her flip through the pages, not with the detached speed of someone scanning for flaws, but with a slower, more deliberate focus, as if each line required a second look, and that alone shifted something inside him, because this was the first time anyone in a position like hers had taken his work seriously enough to actually sit with it, and for a moment, the room felt quieter than it should have, the kind of silence that carried weight instead of dismissal. "You built this without outside funding?" she asked, her eyes still on the numbers, and he nodded, leaning slightly against the edge of the table, "Just small contracts, local businesses, reinvesting everything back in," and she exhaled softly, not impressed in the way people usually pretended to be, but in a way that suggested recalculation, like she was adjusting a model that no longer fit the assumptions she had made. A sudden knock broke the moment again, sharper this time, and before either of them could respond, Lauren stepped in with a tighter expression than before, holding a tablet that she handed directly to Evelyn. "We have a situation with the Denver rollout," she said quietly, but the urgency in her voice filled the room, and for a split second, the old Evelyn surfaced, the one who thrived under pressure, her posture straightening, her attention snapping fully to the screen as she scanned quickly, absorbing, deciding, and then issuing instructions in a tone that left no room for hesitation: delay the launch by 12 hours, reroute support to the back-end team, and get legal on standby, and just like that, the calm had shifted into controlled chaos. Daniel stepped back slightly, instinctively giving her space, watching how effortlessly she moved through it, how natural this world was for her, and for a moment, the gap between them felt wider again, not because of what she had said, but because of everything she represented, a scale of responsibility and pressure he had never touched, and maybe never would. When Lauren left, closing the door behind her, the room settled again, but not completely, the tension lingering in the air like a storm that hadn't fully passed, and Evelyn placed the tablet down, her fingers resting on it for a second longer than necessary before she looked back at him, her expression sharper now, but not colder, just more honest. "This is where things get complicated," she said, tapping lightly on his proposal, and he frowned slightly, not defensive but alert. "Complicated how?" And she held his gaze for a moment, as if deciding how much to say, before continuing. "Your idea works, but not at the scale you think it does," and the words landed heavier than expected, not dismissive, but challenging, and he straightened slightly, the familiar tension returning. "Then show me where it breaks," he said, more firmly than before, and that made something shift in her expression again, a flicker of respect, or maybe surprise, because he wasn't backing down, not even now. Outside, the city continued its relentless movement, but inside that office, something more personal was unfolding, a collision between two different ways of surviving, hers built on control and precision, his built on persistence and belief, and as Evelyn stepped closer to the table, flipping to a specific page and pointing at a projection line, she said, "Right here, this assumption doesn't hold under pressure." And for the first time, it wasn't about whether he belonged in the room, it was about whether what he had built could stand up to the reality she lived in every day. And as Daniel leaned in to look, his brow tightening slightly, he realized this wasn't a second chance to be accepted, it was something harder, something that would force him to either defend what he believed in or watch it fall apart right in front of her. Daniel leaned closer to the page she had pointed at, his eyes scanning the projection line she claimed would fail under pressure, and for a moment, he didn't respond, not because he agreed, but because he was recalculating, replaying every late night where he had tested those numbers against real clients, real constraints, real limitations, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter but more grounded than before. "It holds, just not the way you're expecting it to," and that made Evelyn pause, her fingers still resting on the edge of the paper as she looked at him again, this time not as someone to correct, but as someone she might have misunderstood twice now. "Explain," she said, and there was no impatience in it, just a direct request, and Daniel nodded slightly, flipping the page back and tracing a different path through the model. "You're scaling it like a corporate rollout, top-down, heavy infrastructure, but that's not how this works," he said, his tone steady as he pointed to a smaller cluster of numbers. "It grows sideways first, community-based, low overhead, built on trust before expansion," and as he spoke, something shifted in the room. Again, not dramatic, but subtle and undeniable, because for the first time, he wasn't defending himself, he was teaching her something. A sudden buzz from her phone interrupted again, sharper this time, and she glanced at it instinctively before stopping herself, turning the screen face down without reading it, a small act that cost her more than it seemed, and Daniel noticed, not the gesture itself, but the tension behind it, the way her world kept pulling at her even when she chose to stay present. "That's not how companies survive at scale," she said after a moment, but there was less certainty in it now, more of a challenge than a dismissal, and he met her gaze without hesitation. "Maybe not yours," he replied, and that line landed differently than anything else he had said, not confrontational, but honest in a way that cut through the assumptions she had built her career on. Outside, clouds had started to gather, dimming the sunlight that had filled the office earlier, casting a softer, more uncertain light across the room, and Evelyn stepped back slightly, crossing her arms not as a barrier but as a way to think, her eyes narrowing just enough to signal that something deeper was shifting beneath the surface, and then she said something that neither of them had expected her to admit out loud, "I didn't start like this." And the words hung there, heavier than any data point, because they didn't belong to the CEO he had met yesterday, they belonged to someone else, someone earlier, someone she hadn't shown anyone in a long time. Daniel didn't interrupt, didn't push, just waited, and that silence gave her space to continue, her voice quieter now, less controlled. "My first company failed in less than a year. I trusted the wrong people, built something I thought would grow the way you're describing, and it collapsed before it even had a chance, and there it was, the shift, the truth that reframed everything, not just her skepticism, but the way she had looked at him from the start, not as someone too simple, but as someone dangerously close to a version of herself she had buried. A distant roll of thunder echoed faintly outside, the kind that signaled a storm still forming, and Daniel felt something inside him tighten, not from doubt, but from understanding, because suddenly this wasn't just about his idea being challenged, it was about her fear of watching the same kind of failure happen again, and as she looked back at him, her expression no longer guarded but conflicted, she said quietly, "I'm not trying to tear this apart. I'm trying to see if it survives reality," and in that moment, the tension between them changed completely, no longer about approval or rejection, but about whether two people with very different scars could find a way to trust the same vision. The silence that followed her confession didn't feel empty, it felt fragile, like something had been set down between them that could easily break if either of them moved too quickly, and Daniel stayed where he was, his hand still resting lightly on the edge of the table, his mind no longer focused on projections or scaling models but on the shift he had just witnessed. Because the woman standing in front of him now wasn't the same one who had dismissed him the day before, and that difference mattered more than either of them seemed ready to admit. "So you're not testing the idea," he said slowly, his voice steady but edged with something deeper now, "you're testing whether I'm about to make the same mistake you did," and the words landed with a quiet weight that made Evelyn inhale sharply, not in offense, but in recognition, as if he had just said something she hadn't fully allowed herself to think. A sharp knock interrupted again, louder this time, and before she could respond, the door opened and Lauren stepped in, her composure tighter than before. "We have a bigger issue," she said, her voice low but urgent. "Denver didn't just delay, it's failing, systems are crashing across multiple clients," and the room shifted instantly, the controlled environment cracking under the pressure of something real, something immediate, and Evelyn turned toward the tablet Lauren handed her, her eyes scanning rapidly, absorbing the damage, calculating responses, but there was a flicker of something else now, something less certain than before. "Get the emergency team on it," she said quickly, but her voice wasn't as sharp, not as absolute, and Daniel watched that, recognizing the moment for what it was, not just a business crisis, but a fracture in the certainty she relied on. "What's the model they used?" he asked before he could stop himself, and both women looked at him, surprised, and Lauren hesitated before answering. "Standard rollout, centralized infrastructure," and Daniel let out a quiet breath, his jaw tightening slightly as he glanced back at the proposal still open on the table, then at Evelyn, who was already looking at him, the connection forming before either of them said it out loud. "It's breaking under pressure," he said, not as a challenge this time, but as a fact, and something in Evelyn's expression shifted again, sharper, more exposed, because this wasn't theoretical anymore, this was happening in real time, exactly where she had claimed his model wouldn't hold, and yet it was hers that was collapsing. The room filled with a low hum of tension, the kind that made every second feel heavier, and Evelyn stepped back slightly, running a hand through her hair in a gesture that broke her composure for the first time, her control slipping just enough to reveal the strain underneath, and then she said quietly, almost to herself, "No, this shouldn't be happening," but it was, and they all knew it. Another alert buzzed loudly from the tablet, more systems going down, more clients affected, and Lauren spoke again, faster now, "We're losing accounts if this isn't contained," and that was the moment everything tipped, not just the situation, but Evelyn herself, because the weight of it, the responsibility, the memory of past failure, it all collided at once, and she turned back toward the table, her breath uneven now, her voice no longer controlled. "I built this to be stronger than that," she said, louder than before, and there was something raw in it, something that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with fear. Daniel didn't move closer, didn't interrupt, but he didn't step away either, and as she looked at him again, her composure finally cracking, her eyes no longer guarded but overwhelmed, it became clear that this wasn't just a breakdown of systems, it was the beginning of something unraveling inside her, something she had held together for far too long, and for the first time since they met, she wasn't the one in control of the room anymore. The alerts didn't stop, they multiplied, each vibration from the tablet sharper than the last, echoing through the room like a countdown no one could silence, and Evelyn stood there for a second too long without moving, her breath uneven, her usual precision slipping under the weight of something she couldn't immediately control. And that hesitation alone was enough for Daniel to realize just how close this was to something breaking beyond business, because this wasn't just about systems failing, it was about everything she had built being tested in a way she had tried to avoid ever since that first company collapsed. "You need to decentralize it," he said suddenly, stepping forward now, his voice firm but not forceful, cutting through the noise just enough to be heard, and Lauren looked at him instinctively, unsure whether to question or listen, while Evelyn's eyes locked onto his, searching for something, not confidence, but certainty she could lean on, even if she didn't want to admit it. "You don't have time to rebuild everything," Daniel continued, already pulling the tablet slightly toward him, careful but decisive, "but you can stop the bleeding if you reroute the load into smaller independent clusters, let them operate locally instead of forcing everything through one system," and as he spoke, his tone shifted into something more active, less defensive, because this wasn't about proving a point anymore. It was about solving something real, something happening right now. "That's not how our infrastructure is designed," Lauren said quickly, tension in her voice, but Daniel shook his head once, already scanning through the data. "Then you adapt it just enough to hold, not perfect, just stable," and he glanced back at Evelyn. "You said you wanted to see if it survives reality. This is reality," and that line hit differently now, not as a challenge, but as a moment she couldn't ignore. Another alert buzzed, louder, and Evelyn flinched slightly before straightening again, forcing herself back into motion, but this time it wasn't the same controlled authority as before, it was something more urgent, more human, and after a brief second that felt longer than it should have, she made a decision she wasn't used to making. "Do it," she said, her voice tight but clear, not to Lauren, but to Daniel, and that shift alone changed everything in the room. Lauren hesitated, just for a second, then nodded quickly, already moving to relay instructions, her voice sharper again as she stepped out, leaving the door slightly open, the noise of the outside team spilling faintly into the space, and Daniel leaned over the table, working through the adjustments with a focus that blocked everything else out, while Evelyn stayed close, closer than before, watching not just what he was doing, but how he was doing it, the calm in his movements, the way he didn't rush even when everything around them demanded speed. Outside, the sky had darkened completely now, rain beginning to tap softly against the glass, building into something heavier, matching the tension inside, and as minutes passed that felt like hours, the alerts began to slow, not stopping completely, but changing, shifting from collapse to containment, and Lauren's voice came back through the doorway, breathless but steadier, it stabilizing, not fixed, but holding, and the words settled into the room like a fragile relief. Evelyn didn't respond immediately, her eyes still on the screen, then slowly lifting to Daniel, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because what had just happened wasn't small, it wasn't theoretical, it was real, undeniable, and it had shifted something fundamental between them, and as the rain hit harder against the windows, filling the silence with a steady rhythm, Evelyn took a small step back, her composure not fully broken anymore but no longer intact either, and said quietly, almost like the words were catching up to her, "I almost lost everything," again, and the way she said it wasn't controlled, it wasn't distant, it was raw, and for the first time, it felt like she wasn't standing above him or across from him, but right there in the same moment, unsure of what came next. The rain didn't stop when the system stabilized, it kept falling, steady and relentless against the glass, as if the world outside needed more time to settle than the one inside that office, and Daniel finally stepped back from the table, exhaling slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to remind him how much he had been holding in, while Evelyn stood still for a moment longer, her eyes fixed on the screen that no longer flashed with urgency but with quiet recovery, and then she looked at him, really looked this time, without distance, without judgment, just something raw and unguarded that had nowhere left to hide. "You didn't just fix that," she said, her voice low, almost unsteady, "you saw it before it happened," and Daniel shook his head slightly, not dismissing her, but grounding the moment. "I've lived in systems that don't survive unless they adapt," he replied, and there was no pride in it, just truth, the kind built from years of figuring things out without a safety net. A sudden burst of applause echoed faintly from outside the office as the team realized the crisis had been contained, the sound unexpected, almost surreal after everything that had just unfolded, and Evelyn turned briefly toward the door, then back to him, her expression shifting again, but this time it didn't return to control, it softened into something else entirely, something closer to vulnerability than authority. Yesterday. I called you simple, she said, taking a small step closer, her voice tightening slightly as if the words themselves carried weight she hadn't anticipated, and Daniel didn't interrupt, didn't look away, just waited, giving her the space she clearly wasn't used to taking. I was wrong, she continued, more firmly now, but there was something breaking underneath it, something she couldn't contain anymore, and before she could stop herself, she let out a breath that turned into something sharper, her composure finally cracking in a way that had nothing to do with business, her eyes glistening as she shook her head slightly, almost frustrated at herself. I built everything around never being that version of me again, the one who trusted the wrong things, the wrong people, and her voice wavered, just enough to make it real, undeniable. Daniel took a small step forward. Now, not closing the distance completely, but enough to meet her where she stood, and maybe you went too far the other way, he said quietly, and that was it, the line that broke whatever control she had left, because suddenly this wasn't about systems or companies or past failures, it was about her, standing there, realizing she had been measuring strength all wrong. The room fell silent again, the rain louder now, filling the space between them, and then, without overthinking it, without calculating the outcome the way she always did, Evelyn made a decision she had never made before, something irreversible, something that didn't fit the version of herself she had spent years protecting, and slowly, almost hesitantly at first, she stepped closer and dropped to one knee in front of him. The movement so unexpected, so unfiltered, that it seemed to pause the entire world around them. Daniel froze, his breath catching as he looked down at her, confusion and disbelief colliding in the same moment, and Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes no longer guarded, no longer controlled, but filled with something honest and overwhelming, her voice shaking as she spoke. I don't want to build something strong without someone real beside me, she said, the words coming out uneven but certain. Daniel. I know this isn't how it's supposed to happen, but I can't pretend I don't see what you are anymore. Will you build a life with me? And the question hung there, raw and vulnerable, nothing polished, nothing strategic, just real. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of everything that had led them to this moment, every assumption broken, every wall lowered, and as the rain slowly began to soften, Daniel let out a breath, the weight of everything settling into something clearer, something steady, and though his answer came quietly, it carried more certainty than anything else he had said before. And maybe that's the question this story leaves behind. How often do we mistake simplicity for weakness, and control for strength, and what could change if we saw people for who they really are before it's almost too late? If this story made you feel something, don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the simplest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest.